There she is again. Officer James Chen's voice barely rose above a whisper as he watched the small figure emerge from PS 147. His partner, Officer Maria Rodriguez, shifted in the passenger seat of their unmarked Crown Victoria, while Sergeant Mike Sullivan maintained his steady grip on the steering wheel. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Bedford Avenue, and even from this distance they could see the purple backpack bouncing against the girl's shoulders, too big for her 8-year-old frame, yet somehow fitting for the burden she seemed to carry. "Third time this week," Rodriguez murmured, her experienced eyes scanning the street. Same time, different route. She'd been on the force for 15 years, but something about this situation made her stomach knot in a way she hadn't felt since her rookie days. Sarah Martinez stepped carefully around a broken section of sidewalk, her worn sneakers navigating the familiar terrain with practiced ease. The concrete was cracked and buckled, much like the neighborhood itself. Once proud brownstones now wore decades of neglect like battle scars, their windows watching the street with tired indifference. Sullivan eased the car forward, maintaining their careful distance. "We stick to protocol," he reminded them, though his white-knuckled grip on the wheel betrayed his own concern. "No contact unless absolutely necessary. We're here to observe, nothing more." But they all knew this wasn't standard procedure. There was nothing in the manual about 3 veteran officers spending their afternoons tailing an elementary school student. Nothing about the way their hearts collectively tightened when she passed the corner where the dealers usually stood, or how they held their breath until she cleared the alley where the gang kids gathered. Chen watched Sarah pause at a crosswalk, her small hand clutching the straps of her backpack. "My daughter's about her age," she said softly, the words carrying the weight of every parent's fear. "I can't imagine letting her walk these streets alone." A group of teenagers loitered near the bodega ahead, their hoodies marked with colors that claimed allegiance to local crews. Sarah's path would take her right past them. Rodriguez's hand instinctively moved toward her radio, but Sullivan shook his head. "Wait," he cautioned, years of experience in his voice. "Watch." They observed as Sarah squared her tiny shoulders and altered her course slightly, giving the group a wide berth while keeping her pace steady, not too fast to show fear, not too slow to catch attention. It was the walk of someone who had learned too young how to be invisible in a dangerous world. "She shouldn't have to be this smart about it," Rodriguez said, anger and admiration mixing in her tone. "No kid should have to navigate their own neighborhood like it's a war zone." The sun continued its descent behind the projects, painting the sky in shades of amber and purple. As Sarah turned onto Kingston Avenue, the officers exchanged glances, each carrying the same unspoken question. How long could they watch before duty or conscience demanded they do more than just observe? The Martinez apartment sat on the 4th floor of a weathered brick building that had seen better decades. Inside, while most of the neighborhood slept, Carmen Martinez would prepare for another day of endless hours. She'd kiss her sleeping children goodbye. Sarah, 8, Miguel, 6 and Luna, 4, before heading to her first job at the hospital laundry. By the time Sarah woke to get her siblings ready for school, their mother would be 2 hours into her shift. Sarah had memorized her mother's schedule like a well-worn prayer. Hospital laundry from 4 a.m. to noon, a quick change of clothes for her afternoon shift at the supermarket deli counter, then 3 nights a week at the local cleaning service. The schedule was written in neat handwriting on their refrigerator, though Sarah hardly needed to look at it anymore. She'd learned to tell time by her mother's absences. "Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who never asked to be strong," Officer Rodriguez had said one afternoon, watching Sarah shepherd her younger siblings into the bodega. Rodriguez recognized the look in Sarah's eyes, the same one she'd worn 30 years ago on these very streets, when she too had been a child raising children. In the passenger seat, Officer James Chen shifted uncomfortably. At 32, he was the youngest of the 3 officers, with just 4 years on the force. His daughter Sophie's 5th birthday party had been last weekend, all pink balloons and princess crowns. She'd never known a moment where she wasn't protected, cherished, safe. The contrast with Sarah's life struck him like a physical blow every time he watched her navigate these streets with adult wariness. "You're thinking about Sophie again," Rodriguez observed, her voice gentle. In their 3 months as partners, she'd learned to read Chen's tells, the way he gripped his notebook too tight, how his jaw clenched when they passed the playground Sarah never stopped to play in. "I keep wondering what I'd do," Chen admitted, "if it was my daughter walking these streets alone." Sophie can barely tie her shoes without calling for help. And here's Sarah, basically running a household. From the driver's seat, Sergeant Sullivan's weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes followed Sarah's progress with the intensity of a man haunted by his own history. 23 years on the force had left their marks, some visible in the grey at his temples, others hidden deeper, like the case file he kept locked in his desk drawer. Jennifer Anders, he said suddenly, breaking his usual stoic silence. Same age as Sarah. Same neighborhood, different decade. She used to wave to our patrol car every morning on her way to school, his knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. One morning she didn't wave. We found her shoe by the canal 3 days later. Rodriguez and Chen exchanged glances. Everyone in the precinct knew about the Anders case, Sullivan's white whale, the one that drove him to request this beat long after he could have moved up to a cushier assignment. What they hadn't known was how personal it was. That's not Sarah's story, Rodriguez said firmly, her own history lending weight to her words. I grew up 6 blocks from here. Single mother, 3 jobs, just like Carmen Martinez. You know what saved me? Officers like my old beat cop, Thompson. He'd watch out for us kids, really see us. Not just as potential victims or statistics, but as people worth protecting. The squad car fell silent as they watched Sarah emerge from the bodega, plastic bags cutting into her small hands. She'd added something to her usual purchases, a single bright yellow flower, probably for the window box she carefully tended outside their apartment. Most kids her age are watching cartoons after school, Chen mused, but she's figuring out how to stretch food stamps and keep her siblings quiet so their mum can catch a few hours of sleep between shifts. That's exactly why we're here, Sullivan replied, his voice carrying the weight of old regrets and new purpose. Some people think policing is about catching bad guys, but sometimes it's about making sure the good ones, especially the young ones, get a fair chance at making it. As they watched Sarah make her way home, each officer carried their own version of her story. For Chen, she was a mirror reflecting every parent's fears. For Rodriguez, she was an echo of her own past, a reminder of the thin line between surviving and thriving. And for Sullivan, she represented a chance at redemption, an opportunity to get it right this time, to make sure another young life didn't slip through the cracks of a system that too often looked the other way. Each day revealed new layers to Sarah Martinez's carefully constructed routine. The officers had begun documenting her schedule, not in their official reports, but in a shared notebook that Chen kept in the glove compartment. The entries told a story that grew heavier with each passing day. Monday, 3:15 p.m. Sarah exits school, stops at Mrs. Chen's convenience store, buys milk, bread, and the cheapest package of lunch meat. Counts change 3 times before paying. Look at her hands, Rodriguez pointed out one afternoon, as Sarah struggled with 4 plastic bags cutting into her small fingers. She's got a system. Indeed, Sarah had worked out a method of carrying the heavy bags, switching hands every 30 steps, wrapping the handles around her wrists when her fingers got too numb. They'd watched her perfect this technique over weeks, her face never betraying the strain. Tuesday, 3:45 p.m. picks up siblings from after-school program. Miguel, 6, tries to carry 1 bag. Sarah won't let him. Luna, 4, crying from hunger. Sarah gives her the last granola bar from her own lunch. Sullivan's jaw tightened as he watched through the windshield. She's protecting them from more than just the weight of those groceries. Chen made another note. Sarah checks surroundings every 27 steps counted. Always knows where the nearest shop door is. Smart kid. The route she took home changed daily, but followed a pattern they began to understand. Tuesday's path meant avoiding the north side of Kingston Avenue, where the Royals gang members gathered near the shuttered movie theater. Thursdays, she'd take the long way around Palmer Street, steering clear of the abandoned lot where rival crews conducted their business. She's mapped it all out, Rodriguez realized, watching Sarah make a seemingly random turn down a narrow side street. Every gang boundary, every dealing spot, every place trouble might be waiting. Wednesday, 4:05 p.m. Third day, Sarah's helped old Mrs. Washington with her groceries. Carries them up 3 flights despite already being loaded down. Refuses the quarter Mrs. W tries to give her. My daughter complains about carrying her backpack to the car, Chen said softly, making another entry. Sarah's carrying the weight of an entire household. They observed her system for getting her siblings home safely. Miguel always on her right, Luna on her left, staying between them and the street. She'd developed a game of it, calling out red light when they needed to stop at corners, making them giggle even as she scanned for danger. Thursday 3:30 p.m. new route today. Longer, but avoids the crowd of high school kids who've been hanging around the usual corner. Sarah spotted them before we did. She shouldn't have to be this observant, Rodriguez muttered. Watching Sarah herd her siblings across the street when a group of teenagers appeared ahead. Kids should get to be kids. The breakthrough in understanding her route changes came on a rainy Friday. They'd watched her turn away from her usual path, taking a circuitous route that added 15 minutes to her walk. Initially, they'd assumed it was to avoid the slick steps near the projects. Then Sullivan spotted yellow bandanas on the corner she'd avoided. New territory marking. The Kings have expanded their territory, he explained, making a note on their precinct map. She knew. Probably heard it from the kids at school before we got the intel ourselves. Following her longer route revealed more about Sarah's daily life. She'd stop at the library when she could, grabbing free pencils and scratch paper left out by the sympathetic librarian. Some days she'd pause at the community center bulletin board, carefully copying down information about free meals and after-school programs. Sunday 2:15 p.m. laundromat day. Sarah manages 3 loads while helping siblings with homework, uses breaks between cycles to mend Miguel's torn jacket with a small sewing kit she keeps in her backpack. She does the laundry like a tactical operation, Chen observed, watching Sarah efficiently sort clothes while keeping her siblings occupied with homework and quiet games. Everything planned, timed, optimized. The officers had begun rotating their surveillance shifts, each unwilling to leave her unprotected for long. They learned her patterns, how she'd wait in the school entrance until exactly 3:15, when the high school kids had cleared out. How she taught Miguel to tie his shoes under the flickering light of the bus stop, keeping them both visible in the safer space. Walking encyclopedia of street survival, Rodriguez commented one day as they watched Sarah guide her siblings around a group of guys she somehow knew to avoid. And she's teaching the little ones too. The gravity of her situation became clearest when they discovered why she sometimes took the longest route home, a 30-minute detour that made no sense until they spotted the community fridge tucked behind the Methodist church. Sarah would quickly grab a few items, always leaving something in return: a can of soup one day, a package of pasta another. She's not just surviving, Sullivan realized, his voice rough with emotion. She's building a network, trading resources, creating safe spaces and fallback plans. Friday, 4:10 p.m. Sarah stayed late at school. Reason discovered she's been tutoring younger kids for extra snacks to bring home. Teacher confirmed she's top of her class despite everything. The officer's notebook grew thicker with observations, each entry adding to their understanding of Sarah's world. But with that understanding came an increasing sense of urgency. But they weren't just watching a child navigate poverty, they were witnessing a young girl construct an elaborate defense system against dangers that no child should have to understand. We're going to have to do something, Chen said finally, watching Sarah adjust her route, yet again to avoid a new threat none of them had spotted yet. Protocol or not? Sullivan nodded, his expression grim. Question is, how do we help without destroying the system she's built to protect herself and her family? As if in answer, Sarah paused at the corner, shifting her bags to wave at Mrs. Washington. The elderly woman beamed, then turned to water the small window box of flowers they now knew Sarah had helped her plant, creating one more friendly outpost in her carefully mapped territory. Rodriguez smiled sadly. Maybe we start by understanding that she's not just avoiding dangers, she's building something worth protecting. The day everything changed started like any other. Sarah had just picked up her siblings from school, her purple backpack heavy with borrowed library books. But something was different about Kingston Avenue. The usual teenagers weren't on their corner, and the bodega's security gate was only half open, a warning sign Sarah caught before the officers did. Something's off, Rodriguez murmured, scanning the unusually empty street. Where is everyone? They got their answer as Sarah rounded the corner. A group of teenagers, new faces, wearing colors they hadn't seen in the neighborhood before, blocked the narrow sidewalk. Sarah stopped abruptly, pulling Miguel and Luna closer to her sides. Sullivan's hand moved to his radio. Those aren't local kids. Rival gang, Rodriguez confirmed, recognizing the signs from her gang unit days. They're pushing into new territory. Sarah began her usual evasive maneuver, trying to cross the street, but two more teens emerged from the alley behind her. She was boxed in. Inside the unmarked car, Chen's knuckles whitened. "We need to move. Now." "Wait," Sullivan ordered, though his own body was tense as a wire. "She might have a play here. We move too soon, we could make it worse." The memory of another incident, 6 months ago, flashed through Sullivan's mind. A young boy, not much older than Sarah, had been caught in similar circumstances. The police intervention had sparked a week of escalating violence that left 3 teenagers dead and a neighborhood in chaos. Sarah's voice carried across the street, steady despite her situation. "My mum works at the hospital with your cousin, Marcus," she was saying to the tallest teenager. "She helped him when he got hurt last month." Rodriguez inhaled sharply. Smart girl. She's establishing connection, making herself human to them. But the teenagers were moving closer. One of them reached for Sarah's backpack. "That's it," Chen said, reaching for his door handle. "We can't just." Officer Chen Sullivan's voice cut through the tension. "Look at her hands." Sarah had shifted her stance slightly, angling herself between the teenagers and her siblings. Her right hand was raised in what looked like surrender, but her left was making subtle gestures behind her back, signals that Miguel and Luna clearly understood, as they began inching backward toward the bodega's half-open gate. The memory of another child hit Sullivan like a physical blow. Jennifer Anders had been alone when the gang members approached her. No one had taught her how to handle such situations. No one had been watching. No one had known what to do when Sarge Rodriguez's urgent voice snapped him back to the present. "We've got movement on the corner." Mrs. Washington had appeared in her doorway, phone visible in her hand. On the opposite corner, the bodega owner was quietly ushering Miguel and Luna inside. The street wasn't as empty as it had seemed. Sarah's carefully cultivated network of allies was activating around her. "Your cousin Marcus," Sarah continued, her voice carrying clearly to the officer's car. "He told my mum you guys are supposed to be protecting the neighborhood, not scaring little kids. Is that what you're doing right now? Protecting?" The teenager's stance shifted uncertainly. Behind him, a police siren wailed in the distance. Mrs. Washington's call had done its work. "She's boxing them in," Rodriguez realized with growing admiration, using their own code against them while putting them in a position where they'll look weak if they hassle her. The teenagers were already backing away, their bravado deflating as more faces appeared in windows above. Someone was filming from a third-floor apartment. The bodega owner had fully raised his security gate with a loud clatter. "Man," whatever the lead teenager muttered, trying to save face. "Just watch yourself." Sarah stood her ground until they retreated, then walked backward toward the bodega, never taking her eyes off their departing figures. Only when she was inside did she finally let her shoulders sag. In the police car, the tension slowly bled out of the air. Chen was shaking his head in disbelief. She had a whole contingency plan in place. All those people watching out for her, she knew exactly who would help. She didn't just avoid the danger, Rodriguez added. She managed it, better than some trained negotiators I've seen. But Sullivan was silent, his mind still split between the present and the past. Sarah was safe, showing the same resilience that had impressed them for weeks. But Jennifer Anders flickered in his memory, another clever girl who'd almost talked her way out of danger, but almost hadn't been enough. "We can't keep watching," he said finally, his voice heavy with decision. "She handled it perfectly today. But tomorrow? Next week? The odds catch up eventually, just like they did with." "This isn't the Anders case," Rodriguez cut in firmly. "Sarah's not alone. She's got her network. She's got us." "But is that enough?" Chen asked, watching through the windshield as Sarah hugged her siblings inside the bodega's safety. "Are we really protecting her by staying in the shadows?" The question hung in the air as they watched Sarah emerge from the bodega, siblings once again at her sides, resuming her journey home as if nothing had happened. But something had shifted, not just for Sarah, who held her siblings a little closer, but for the officers who had witnessed both her vulnerability and her strength. They had started this surveillance to protect a child. Instead, they'd discovered something far more complex, a young girl who had built her own protection system out of necessity, wisdom, and sheer determination. The question was no longer whether to intervene, but how to do so without dismantling the remarkable network she'd created. The day after the gang incident, the officers expected Sarah to lay low, to take the safest routes home, to focus solely on survival. Instead, they witnessed something that changed everything. "She's stopping," Chen noted, as Sarah paused in front of Mrs. Washington's building. Through the windshield, they watched her shift her heavy grocery bags to one hand and bend down to pick up scattered mail that had fallen from the elderly woman's overstuffed mailbox. Rodriguez leaned forward. "Those groceries must weigh half what she does, and she's still—" "Wait," Sullivan interrupted. "Look." Sarah was pulling something from her backpack, a small notebook. She began sorting through Mrs. Washington's mail, checking each envelope against whatever was written in her pages. Medical bills, insurance statements, payment notices. She's keeping track, Rodriguez realized, making sure nothing important gets missed. The revelation hit harder when Mrs. Washington appeared at her door, and they could finally hear the conversation through their partially opened window. "Sarah, sweetheart, you didn't have to come today. Not after yesterday's scare." "It's Thursday, Mrs. Washington," Sarah replied, as if that explained everything. "You've got your doctor's appointment tomorrow. I wanted to make sure the insurance card came." Chen was already flipping through their observation notebook. "Every Thursday," he murmured. "How did we miss this? She's been doing this for weeks." But there was more. Sarah pulled out a flyer from her backpack, something they recognized from the community center bulletin board. "The senior center is starting computer classes," she explained to Mrs. Washington. "They can teach you how to do the bills online. Miguel and Luna can stay with you while I'm at the youth program, and we can all walk home together." Sullivan's breath caught. The youth program. Rodriguez was already pulling up the community center schedule on her phone. Her eyes widened. Tuesday and Thursday evenings. Youth Leadership Initiative. It's a mentoring program. Wait, she scrolled further. Look who started it. She passed the phone to Sullivan. There, at the bottom of the page, was a familiar name, Jennifer Anders. Before she died, Sullivan said softly, Jennifer was trying to start a program for neighborhood kids, teaching them how to stay safe, how to build community connections, the kind of things she never got the chance to learn. Through the windshield, they watched as Sarah helped Mrs. Washington down the steps, explaining the computer class schedule. The elderly woman's arthritic hands clutched both the mail and Sarah's carefully prepared notes. "We've been looking at this all wrong," Rodriguez said suddenly. "We thought we were watching her because she needed protection. But look at what she's actually doing." Chen nodded slowly. "She's not just surviving. She's rebuilding the neighborhood's support system, just like Jennifer wanted to do." The pieces began falling into place. Sarah's changing routes weren't just about avoiding danger, they were about checking on different neighbors each day. Her stops at the community center weren't just about finding resources for herself, she was gathering information to share with others. Even her careful observations of gang activity served a larger purpose, helping other kids navigate the neighborhood safely. "That's why we couldn't stop watching," Sullivan said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not because she was vulnerable, but because she was doing something extraordinary, something Jennifer died trying to accomplish." They watched as Sarah finished helping Mrs. Washington, then continued her journey home, still bearing the weight of her groceries. But now they saw her differently, not as a child who needed saving, but as a force for change they needed to protect and support. "So what do we do now?" Chen asked, watching Sarah's small figure grow distant. Sullivan straightened in his seat, decision clear in his eyes. "We stop hiding in the shadows. It's time to help her build something Jennifer would have been proud of." As they followed Sarah's final steps home, each officer understood that their mission had fundamentally changed. They weren't just watching over a vulnerable child, they were witnessing the birth of something Jennifer Anders had dreamed of, a community coming together. Led by an 8-year-old girl who refused to let her circumstances define her neighborhood's future. The decision to act came on a rain-soaked Tuesday evening. When Carmen Martinez's late shift at the hospital coincided with an escalating gang situation in the neighborhood. Sarah had stayed late at the community center, helping younger kids with homework, unaware that both rival groups were converging on the street outside. "This is different," Rodriguez said, watching gang members gather at both ends of the block. "They're not just marking territory anymore." Sullivan's police radio crackled with reports of weapons spotted in the area. Inside the community center's bright windows, they could see Sarah packing up her tutoring materials, oblivious to the danger building outside. "We're done watching," Sullivan announced, his voice carrying the weight of weeks of observation and years of regret. "Chen, call for backup. Rodriguez, with me." As Chen radioed for support, Sullivan and Rodriguez stepped out of their unmarked car for the first time in weeks of surveillance. The gang members noticed immediately, some scattering into alleys, others standing their ground with challenging stares. "Sarah's not coming out that door into a crossfire," Sullivan stated, his badge now visible as he approached the nearest group. "Not today. Not ever." Inside the community center, Sarah was gathering her siblings when Mrs. Washington burst through the door, out of breath. "Child, you need to stay put. There's trouble brewing out there." But Sarah's face had already shifted into its familiar calculation mode. "Is it both groups? Like last summer?" Before Mrs. Washington could answer, the community center's director was hurrying over. "Sarah, your mother's on the phone. She's stuck at the hospital because of the weather, and she's worried sick." Outside, Rodriguez had positioned herself near the center's entrance while Sullivan continued engaging with the gang members. Chen's voice came through their radios. Backup was 3 minutes out. Then Sarah did something that changed everything. Instead of cowering inside, she walked to the community center's front window, pulled out her phone, and started recording. "Hey," she called through the glass, her voice carrying surprisingly well. "Marcus from the hospital asked me to record any trouble on his corner. Said his cousin would want to know who's causing problems for the neighborhood kids." The gang members shifted uncomfortably. Sarah's phone kept recording as she continued. "Plus, Mrs. Washington is live streaming from upstairs. Mr. Lee from the bodega has his security cameras running, and..." She paused, finally noticing the officers. "Looks like the police are here too. Lots of witnesses." The tension in the air began to crack as some of the younger gang members backed away, suddenly conscious of how many eyes were on them. Then, from around the corner, came the wail of approaching sirens. Carmen Martinez arrived just as the situation was diffusing, her hospital scrubs still on, having left work early despite the rain. She ran toward the community center, only to find her daughter calmly organizing a phone chain with the parents inside, making sure everyone had a safe ride home. "Mummy," Sarah said, turning to her mother with those two old eyes, "you didn't have to leave work. The officers were watching out for us." That's when Rodriguez stepped forward, finally making formal introductions. "Mrs. Martinez, we need to talk about your daughter, but not about what you might think." Over the next hour, as the rain continued outside, the truth came out. The officers explained their weeks of surveillance, not just of Sarah's vulnerability, but of her strength. They told Carmen about the youth program, about how her daughter had been rebuilding the neighborhood support networks, about Jennifer Anders and the legacy her daughter had unknowingly taken up. Carmen listened, tears mixing with rain on her cheeks, as neighbors began arriving. Mrs. Washington, the bodega owner, parents of kids Sarah tutored, each with their own story of how her 8-year-old daughter had touched their lives. "We're not here to take over," Sullivan explained gently. "We're here to help her build something real, something that'll last. With your permission, Mrs. Martinez, we'd like to make the Youth Leadership Initiative an official police community partnership program, with Sarah as our first junior coordinator." In the middle of it all stood Sarah, still holding her phone, still watching out for everyone else. But now, for the first time, she wasn't standing alone. 6 months later, the transformation of Kingston Avenue was visible in more than just its freshly painted storefronts. The Youth Leadership Initiative, now operating out of a renovated community center space, had become a model for community policing programs across the city. Sarah's mother had been able to cut back to 2 jobs, thanks to a position officer Rodriguez helped her secure at the police department's community outreach office. The sight of Carmen Martinez coordinating neighborhood watch schedules while Sarah helped younger kids with homework had become a regular evening scene at the center. "Remember when we thought we were protecting her?" Chen mused one afternoon, watching Sarah lead a group of children in a safety awareness workshop. His own daughter Sophie now attended these sessions, learning alongside neighborhood kids about community building and street smarts. Sullivan had finally closed Jennifer Anders' case file, not because he'd forgotten, but because he'd found a better way to honor her memory. The program she'd dreamed of now thrived, with Sarah's natural leadership helping bridge the gap between police and community that had seemed impossibly wide just months ago. Mrs. Washington's computer skills class had expanded into a senior citizen support network, with local teens helping elderly residents navigate everything from online banking to video calls with grandchildren. The bodega owner had replaced his security gate with a bright awning, and the corner where gang members once stood now hosted a weekly community market. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the neighborhood viewed itself. What had started with 3 officers watching one remarkable 8-year-old girl had grown into a community that watched out for all its children, proving that sometimes the greatest protection comes not from shadows, but from stepping into the light together. Sometimes the most extraordinary stories start with a simple act of watching. 3 police officers following an 8-year-old girl didn't just change one neighborhood, they reminded us all what real protection looks like. It's not always about badges or sirens. Sometimes it's about seeing the quiet heroes in our midst, the ones who build safety not through force, but through connection. Sarah Martinez taught us that strength isn't measured by size, but by the size of your impact on others. And while not every neighborhood has a Sarah, every community has someone working to make it better, someone who just might need others to notice, to support, to join in. If this story touched your heart, don't let it end here. Hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories about everyday heroes making extraordinary changes. Share this video with someone who needs reminding that we're all responsible for each other's safety. Leave a comment below about someone in your community who deserves recognition. Who's your neighborhood Sarah? Who are the silent guardians in your life? Remember, real change doesn't always start with grand gestures. Sometimes it starts with simply paying attention to the quiet heroes walking their own Kingston avenues. Don't forget to ring that notification bell to catch our next inspiring story. Until then, keep watching out for each other. You never know whose life you might change.